Alright, good morning everybody, and welcome to another YouTube or ePrime live stream. My name is Devon. I am the training coordinator for Psychology Software Tools, and today we have a pretty fun live stream. So today's live stream is all about ePrime 3 tips and tricks. So I actually had a really fun morning this morning. I kind of ambushed a lot of my coworkers as they were walking into work today, and I asked each one of them what their favorite ePrime tip and trick is. So things that some of our users might not know, things that may be a little hidden in our documentation, and things that you may not know to help make your ePrime experience a lot faster and a lot nicer that are, kind of built into the program already. So I kind of split what we gathered today into 4 categories. The first one we're going to talk about is keyboard shortcuts. The next one is I'm going to teach you about some time-saving tips, so things that you can do in ePrime to help kind of save you time and do things a little faster. And the next thing I'm going to talk about is some lesser-known ePrime features, so things that people may not know exist, some things that ePrime can do that people might not realize. And my last one are some scripting tips, so things you can do in script, things that you should do in script that not a lot of people might know about and that are really useful in the long run. So let's go ahead and start with the keyboard shortcuts, because that's honestly one of my favorite ones. So I'm just going to go ahead and open up just a basic ePrime experiment here just to demonstrate a lot of these things. If you're following along at home, you can follow along, just using any old ePrime experiment. There are a couple that are specific to inline objects, obviously, so you'll want something like that if you're following along. But for the most part, they should be fine. And do keep in mind that a lot of these tips are strictly for ePrime 3. Some of these tips and tricks here aren't necessarily going to apply to ePrime 2. Alright, so the first one that I want to talk about is if you're ever in an inline object. Let's say I'm in an inline object here and I'm just writing some script. Just call it the attribute. And I'll set this to... Let's say I'm running some script and I go, oh man, what is the c.setAttrib statement? How do I do that? All I need to do when I am in an inline object is hit F1 on the keyboard. If I go ahead and hit F1 on the keyboard, what that actually does is that actually opens up, if I have the inline object highlighted, if I hit F1 on the keyboard, it actually opens up ePrime's command reference, and it's opening up on that window over there. But that's the same way, or that's the same thing as clicking help and clicking on ePrime command reference here. So it'll bring up this window over here, ePrime command reference. And what ePrime command reference is for ePrime 3 is it's our repository of the entirety of the eBasic language. So it lets you know some top topics here, how to use eBasic script, how you would do that. It lets you know what kind of task events you can use. We have our objects by structure, so what the data type is, what our commands by type are. So here are some audio control commands. We have display dialog commands. Anything you need to know about inline script can be found in this ePrime command reference. And like I said, if you're just in that inline object, the easiest way to get to it, instead of having to click on help and search for it, is just hit F1 and it'll bring it right up. So the next one I have is if I have an experiment that's ready to run, all I need to do in order to run it, and I'm not necessarily going to do this just because of the live stream, but if you hit F7 on the keyboard, that's just going to go ahead and automatically run your experiment right away without having to worry about having to find the run button, or if you're in a hurry and just want to type F7 on the keyboard. That's our keyboard shortcut for eRun. So the next one that we have is Control W. If you hit Control W on the keyboard, it'll bring up this windowed mode. Windowed mode allows you to run ePrime in obviously its own window. This is what I do for a lot of the live streams, so if I just click on that, my experiment will then run in windowed mode. And instead of having to get to windowed mode by clicking on this windowed mode button and then selecting everything, you just do it by clicking Control W on the keyboard. Now if I'm ever making edits to my experiment, and I see that they're not necessarily being reflected in this structure window, one of the better ways to show you this would be for me to add, let's say, a practice block here. Doesn't exist, so I could create it. Yes, I would. And then if I take this practice block and drag it just before my block proc, you'll see that now my practice block appears before my block proc in my procedure, but it doesn't show up the same over here. So if you ever find yourself in this situation where you're making edits to your ePrime experiment that change the structure of the experiment or change what the structure window here looks like, and it's not actually being reflected in the structure window, go ahead and click once in the structure window and hit F5. F5 is our refresh button in the Experiment Explorer structure window here. It'll refresh the experiment to match whatever properties you just changed. So if you saw when I hit F5, the practice block jumped from just after the block proc to just before the block proc. So that's another helpful little keyboard shortcut. And then the last one that I have, and I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this practice block. There we go. I'll delete it from unreferenced. There we go. Another one the last keyboard shortcut that we have is actually pretty well documented, and that's how to get into the different views in ePrime. So the different windows that we have, so the Experiment Explorer, the Toolbox, the Properties page, the Script object, all of these objects can be referenced by just clicking Alt and then clicking on one of these objects, or one of these numbers. So if, for example, if I want to see the contents of my user script because I want to type something, all I have to do is hit Alt 7 and the user script comes up. And these are all right next to their associated property here under the View tab. So it's a really easy way to kind of reference this if you don't have these memorized. But I know I personally use these all the time whenever I'm scripting, because it's just easier for me to click on the tab that I want, and then it'll open up. So those are a lot of the keyboard shortcuts that we have. We also have a couple of keyboard shortcuts that are specific to the ScriptSense property. And I actually have a really great Excel sheet right here. So by using any of these keyboard shortcuts in ScriptSense, this is how you would do some of the different properties. So F3, for example, in ScriptSense is auto search. You can also use it to do find next and find previous. The G shows the go to inline dialog. So if you're ever in ScriptSense, a lot of these functions here are going to be really helpful tools in order to show you how to navigate ScriptSense and navigate them a little better. And here, this category here, it shows you if this is a ScriptSense specific thing or if it is a Windows specific feature. So F3, for example, is the find replace feature in any program, not just ScriptSense. But F2 in this case, these bookmarks are specific to ScriptSense. So this is a really good document if you ever are working with ScriptSense or working with a lot of script and would like to know how to quickly navigate these things. And if you'd like, feel free to message me or email me, or go to support.psnet.com and let me know. I'd be happy to send off this Excel sheet right here, because it's a really helpful list of commands. So the next group of tips that we have are our time-saving tips. Now, the first one that I'm going to talk about is one of my personal favorite time-saving tips. I'm going to show you how all this works. I'm going to go ahead and open up a new instance of ePrime here. Let me get rid of that command reference. So I'm going to open up a new instance of eStudio here. And you'll notice when it opens, the first page that comes up is our experiment templates. And as soon as it opens up, I'll show you that. But the experiment templates are basically meant to save time and to save just to save a lot of hassle. So you don't have to always make the intro slide, you don't have to always make the feedback slide. And these are literally just 5 of what we believe are probably the most common things that people will want to do with ePrime. But it's not specific to any one particular lab. If you find that your lab, for example, is doing a lot of Stroop paradigm creation, or even if you are a professor and you're teaching ePrime to some of your students, and you think that it's easy for them to just go ahead and load an experiment or a paradigm right off the bat instead of having them make it from scratch, and then once they've loaded that paradigm, they can make the little tweaks that'll make it their own, I recommend making new experiment templates. So that's my time-saving tip, is make new experiment templates, and I'll show you guys how to do that quickly. So I'm just going to start from our product service and support site here. You see how I'm logged in under my name? And the one place that I want to show you guys is this experiment library. So the experiment library is kind of a little tip and trick in and of its own, but it's basically experiments, resource files, and analysis files for a lot of very common psychology tasks. So we have an NBAC here, we have a flanker, a go-no-go, an IAT, an auditory oddball. So this is a really good kind of tip and trick in and of itself, is just know that these exist and kind of use these as a starting point for your own experiment. But I'm going to go ahead and download this Stroop sample here because I want to say that my lab uses Stroop tasks a lot. This is the most common thing that we do, and this is something that I would like my students to kind of use as a starting point for building their own Stroop tasks. And if you look here into the zip archive by opening it up, not only does it come with the Stroop task itself, but it also comes with an analysis file. So we've actually conducted some preliminary analyses on the data that you're going to get from this task, and this is something that you can load into eData8 in order to kind of quickly analyze the data on the way that we did. And we based all of this just strictly on like real life studies that we found online. So the number of trials is correct, or at least one of the more common trial numbers, and the analyses are generally speaking what people would want to do with the descriptive statistics of these tasks. But if I want to make this Stroop sample, or anything that I've made, one of the templates that appears when I open ePrime, all I have to do is actually just go into my file explorer here. I'm going to go to the C drive. I'm going to go to Program Files, find that PST folder, which is our folder, go to ePrime 3.0, and then go to Templates. Now if you look in here, these are just ES2 or ES3 files that represent all of the different types of templates that I have, and these are the exact experiments that load whenever I open ePrime. So if I take my experiment that I want, hit Control-C to copy, or you can actually right-click and click Copy if you want, and then in this Templates folder, go ahead and paste that. It'll say you need to provide administrator access. Of course I do. Go ahead and click Continue. And then now my Stroop experiment will show up in there. So now that I've loaded my Stroop experiment into that, let's go ahead and exit out of eStudio and we'll restart it. And now what we should see whenever eStudio opens is, instead of just that standard list of ePrime templates, we should now have my Stroop sample there as well. So that means that now every time I open ePrime, I have that Stroop experiment right here primed and ready to go. I go ahead and double click on it, and it will now load a Stroop task into eStudio without me having to really do much work aside from that. Yeah, so I have an entire Stroop task, script and all, and there's nothing I really needed to do aside from just throw that into my experiment templates folder. So this is a really useful time-saving tip and trick. Especially if, like I said, if you have like a lab of students that you're teaching, or you find that you're always loading or always making the same Stroop task, and oh, where did I save it this time? Did I save it in this folder? Did I save it in this folder? That way you just have it whenever you open ePrime. So I talked a lot to tech support about what their favorite tips and tricks are in ePrime, and these next couple really help out with the kind of the troubleshooting aspect of ePrime. So you can kind of tell what department this was from. This one, the one that they liked the most, was this running at 4 times normal speed if you combine it with this eRun enable auto response here. So what this does, running at 4 times normal speed, is it allows you to ramp up how fast your experiment is running. This is strictly for testing purposes, but it allows you to test the experiment without having to sit there and wait out the entire duration of all the tasks of your experiment, especially if it's a particularly long one. So for example, if we look in our trial list, we can see that we're running 120 samples. Now, as a technical consultant, generally speaking, what we see a lot of are people saying, hey, my experiment's not working, and it'll bomb out or it'll error out at about halfway through the experiment. So this is a really great time and effort saving step for us to run at 4 times the normal speed, because then it's going to run about 4 times faster than it would have, and I don't have to sit there and run through every single one of the 120 trials. And also this auto response for eRun test, this is going to allow ePrime to auto respond to anything that the keyboard would have been used to respond to. And in this case, for the Stroop experiment, it's actually going to help us because we have this keyboard device, keyboard input mask here, and they're going to press either 1, 2, 3, and 4 on the keyboard. Now, if you want to change the properties of that auto response, because right now it's just going to kind of hit 1, 2, 3, or 4 however it wants, you're going to have to go into the experiment object at the top of the window here, go into Devices, and click on that keyboard device. Now under the keyboard device, there's a specific tab for auto response, and I can actually change all of the properties about this auto response that I want. So first one is generate auto responses, period. The next one is a response window. So how long between when a window appears and when it's set to terminate do I want to say, okay, now make a response? In this case, the default value is between 25 and 75% of the mask, or 25 and 75% of the duration. If I want to, and I want to make it much faster, I can change it to, let's say, between 10% and 15%. that way, almost as soon as it appears on screen, especially in using conjunction with that auto response or that clock scale, the to 4 times the normal speed, it's just going to respond right away. And it'll just keep going, response, response, response. And then it says when the time limit is set to infinite or end of procedure, how do I treat the time limit? If I want to make it much faster, I can just set it to 100 milliseconds and it'll just run. You have the chance to set the probability, so E prime can aim for 80% of correct responses. Keep in mind that it's not going to get exactly 80% all of the time, but it's going to be its goal to get 80% correct responses. And then when response is set to any, or when any is set for allowable, how should I treat that allowable response? If you keep it blank like this, E prime will literally hit any key on the keyboard at all. So you might get an ampersand, a percent sign, you might get a shift press, you might get an up arrow, a down arrow. If you want to just stick strictly to alphanumeric or want it to do 1, 2, 3, and 4, you do something like that, or you can just say hit the 1 key if E prime auto responded to anything. That is entirely up to you, but it's just another way to kind of customize that auto response. And then when it says, when an input mass count is greater than 1, issue a number of responses between, and then you get to pick between 25 and 75% of the max count. So let's say my max count for a free response slide object is 1,000. If I only want it to press 1 or 2 keys, I can do this between 10 to 15% as well. But if I do between 25 and 75%, it might get all the way up to 75% of 1,000. So it might end up doing a lot of responses, which is really good if you're stress testing your experiment. And then it says delay a minimum of blank milliseconds between multiple responses. So do you want these to happen very quickly, or do you want them to just kind of take their time? So these are some really nice settings on this auto response. But what this will allow you to do then is if you go into this eRun test property here, ramp it up to 4 times normal speed and enable auto response. And I'm going to run this in windowed mode very quickly just to demonstrate. It's actually just going to make the troubleshooting of this much faster because now on my end, there's nothing that I have to do. I'm not touching the keyboard, I'm not responding to anything, and E prime is just going on its own. It's aiming for that 80% correct, right? Like I said, right now it's hitting 100, it just got one wrong because its goal is to kind of aim for that 80%. So it's going to try to distribute the number of correct and incorrect responses accordingly. But, I mean, this is a really easy troubleshooting step to say, okay, my experiment works, or oh no, my experiment doesn't work. And this is probably the #1 feature that we like to use a lot in tech support, just as, hey, does this experiment function correctly, doesn't function correctly. And the important thing is after this run, it's also going to give you an EDAT file. So not only is it going to just, exit out of the run and visually I can see, okay, it looks like my stimuli is showing up correct. I can see it at the top of the screen very quickly right there. I can also see all of these slide sub-objects appearing correctly, and it looks like my feedback's working right. And if I kind of put this off to the side, I can see everything come in and I can see all my data while that's running, just to kind of verify that, hey, this is definitely how we get these responses, and this is what the data looks like when it comes in, which is really nice for troubleshooting as well. But then once this is done, I'm going to get a data file, and I can actually take a look at my data file and say, is the data that I want there in the first place? I don't have to sit there and slog through all of this. And I can also determine, hey, is this good data with this kind of stuff? Now, E prime is going to do some assumptions. So there's going to be, if I take a look here at my output window, if I take a look at my EDAT file, see, it just did all of that data in the span of however long it took me to talk about that. But it's going to make some assumptions, like the dot onset delay. It's going to kind of approximate. In this case, it's about 1 screen refresh. For the dot onset delay like this, if this is really what you're interested in, I recommend running the experiment not ramping up the clock scale. Whoops. I recommend just running the experiment normally. But it is going to give me a good idea of what my accuracy is going to look like, what the stim color is going to look like, and then even how analyzing the data later is going to look. So this is a really great kind of troubleshooting method. And then let's say I ended up running that and I'm like, you know what, it's not saving stimulus correctly, or maybe instead of this shade of green, I think it would look better in a darker shade of green. Or something serious about your data, like, oh, you know what, I really wanted to log the offset delay, or I wanted to log what the duration should have been, or I want to log on this target offset time. Let's say you really wanted to log this and you notice that it wasn't in your data file. Now if you want to produce a new data file, you don't have to sit there and manually run through each and every one of your trials. You can just do that same eRun test. Now, the last time-saving tip and trick that we have is something called slide layout templates, and this is really going to help you when you're making new experiments from scratch, or if you have kind of novice ePrime users. Now, I've talked about this in a couple other my webinars, and how I kind of framed it was, it helps to space everything out on the slide perfectly, and that's part of it, but it's definitely not the most important part. If you go into this little tab here on any slide object, it'll say Slide Layout Templates, and then just go ahead and click on that little arrow there. And as you can see now, we have a lot of different options for different types of slides that we can make. Now, a lot of these have to do with our new survey objects and our button objects in ePrime, but it's not exclusive to those. So if you'll notice, we have our multiple choice section. So if you're ever using a slide choice object, or if you ever have multiple responses that you want participants to make using a mouse click or using a touch on the keyboard or touch screen, we have rating scales that you can choose from. We have a slider that you can choose from. You can either have a horizontal slider or a vertical slider, and then other kind of arrangements of buttons on the screen. So an on-screen keyboard, a number pad, a circle layout, 10 item recognition, 20 item recognition, 30 item recognition. So it gets pretty powerful, all of these things, and what you can do. It's pretty versatile as well. And I'm going to go ahead and add one, and I'll just add probably one of the most basic ones. It's just this 5-point text slide choice object. So once this loads onto my experiment here, what it's going to do, and the reason why it takes a second to even load into your experiment, is not only does it load a visual component, or the visual components of that slide layout template. I might have to actually add that again. There we go. Kind of slide but mask objects. No. So what I have to do is go into my experiment object here. I'm just going to want to add a button device. There we go. Then now I can add that. There, so I'm going to go ahead and insert that. Now the reason it takes a second to load is because not only is it loading all of these objects on the screen, but if I go into my duration input tab here, first it's changed my input source property to make the accuracy, the RT, and the response all match the slide choice 1 item. But it's also changed my duration input tab as well. Now my duration is set to infinite, my input mask is set to button, and my allowable is now set to next. And if I go into the logging tab here, you can see it also selected all of this to log all of this data in relation to my choice 1 object. So the accuracy, the RT time, the value, it really does set up the entirety of the slide for you instead of just the visual components. So it's a really, really great tool if you want to save a lot of time. And even if this isn't the exact one that I want, let's say that it's close. Let's say that I want to play a movie with the same things on top. I can actually just move this down a little bit more if I want, keep the next button, delete the parts of this that I don't want, and then just add whatever stimuli I want here. And what this does is it just gives you a really, really great baseline to kind of start working from in ePrime. That way the editing process is much faster and much simpler than having to come up with all of this on your own. So that's probably one of my favorite tips and tricks too, is this slide layout template. Alright, so the other one, or the other thing that we have, or the other so the other group of time-saving tips and tricks, there we go, that we have are lesser-known ePrime features. So these are ePrime features that we in the office kind of feel don't get enough love for how cool they are and how much time and how much effort they're going to save you. And the first one I want to talk about is property find and replace. Now, if you're in an inline object, everyone knows that hitting Control F is going to help you look for different statements in your inline object. So let's say I'm looking for get a trib. Go ahead and click find. It's going to highlight all of the instances of get a trib in this document. Now, did you know that you can do that with eObjects as well? So if I go ahead and close this, and then just in my structure window, kind of click once and click Control F to find. Now it's going to take a second, and the reason it takes a second is because it's getting all of the properties of all of the objects in your ePrime experiment. But this is what the property find and replace window looks like. What it allows you to do is first you can select a type. So what type am I going to edit right now? Now I've gone over pretty extensively toolbox defaults, so changing the default of all of the eObjects whenever you're adding them into your experiment. But let's say I made this experiment. Let's say I hate the default font. It's Consolus, and let's say I don't like it at all. Let's say I want to change it to something like Times New Roman. What I would do is I would hop on over here to this Replace tab. And like I said, the reason it takes so long is because it does have to compile all of the information about all of the objects. And the first thing I would do is type. Now, if I'm going to change the font in all of my objects, I have to look at all of the objects that contain font. In this case, it's going to be the text display objects, and then my slide text sub objects, and my feedback objects. So I'm going to go into type, and instead of any, or selecting all, I'm going to go to feedback display. I'm going to go to slide text, and I'm going to go to text display. So those are the three types of object that I'm going to be editing. And then it'll just change type to multiple selected. Now that you have the type that you want to change, go ahead and click on the property that you want to change specifically. And as you can see, these are all of the properties for all of these objects. Now the one that I want in this case is just font name. And then I need to do a comparison. So does font name contains, or is it? I'm going to change font name is and Consolus. Now if I click find all, what this is going to do is this is actually going to show me all of the objects in my experiment that have this font name. So if I look now, my slide 1, state 1, .text 1 is actually named Consolus. So if I go into my slide 1, and then my state 1, and right there, there's that Consolus text. Now it looks like, since this is a slide, or this is an experiment, this is one of our samples here. It looks like it's actually going to be Lucida console. So I'm going to change that one quickly. And then if I hit find all, you can see that this now has a lot more of my objects. So that those are the values, the properties, the font name, and if you look at my structure window, it actually highlights all of the objects that have that property. So I want to replace this all with Times New Roman. I'm just going to hit replace all. And it says replace all operation cannot be undone. Do you want to save the experiment first? I'm going to click no. And it says number of replacements 14. So if I go ahead and get out of the property, find and replace, and hop into my fixation object, my stimulus object, you can see that now all of my font in all of these has been changed from that Lucida console and is actually changed into Times New Roman, which, I mean, honestly, I think I find a little nicer to look at. So that's how you would change, and keep in mind that this property find and replace doesn't just have to do with like font or anything like that. Let's say in this case I want to take a look at all of the durations of my fixation objects. What I would do is go into this this multiple selected type here. Instead of selecting all, I would do my text display. There we go. I can change my property to duration in this case. And then if my duration is, let's say, any, I could just do, those are my previous ones. So let's say anything that I have a duration of 1000 milliseconds on, I want to replace. So let's go ahead and find all quick. And it looks like my fixation and my goodbye have a value of 1000 milliseconds. And I want to change that from 1000 to 500. If I just go ahead and click replace all, I don't want to save. It'll just go ahead and replace all of my durations there. And we also have some more advanced options here, so I can restrict the results found by any of these following. So if, let's say, I have a text display and then I want to do the, let's say name. And if it contains the word, let's say introduction. Is that what it's called? Yeah, instructions. Because I want all of my text display objects with a duration property of 1000, but I don't want to include my constructions, or don't want to include my instructions. Then I click find all, and it's actually going to omit instructions from this search here. So that's a way to kind of restrict what the search would be too. So I'm going to go ahead and close out of this, but that is another really cool time-saving tip. Another time-saving tip, or another tip that is really going to help, is this here. If you go to the tools, what the Tools tab is, it's kind of a little known function, but you can actually access all of eStudio, or everything that ePrime has to offer, so all of our other little programs. So eRun, eData8, eMerge, eRecovery, Codec Config, Package File Editor, Startup Info, Sound Tester. You can actually access all of these directly from eStudio, from inside it. So let's say I have, let's say I'm getting, let's say, video issues when I'm playing this movie that I just randomly added to this slide 1 object here, and it's not playing correctly. And I go to tech support, and tech support says, hey, you should probably check out Codec Config. I would just go to Tools and just click on Codec Config, and then it'll open right over top of eStudio here. So I don't need to go finding, where it's installed on my computer, and especially if you have, depending on the operating system you have, finding it might be a little difficult. So just know that it's always under the toolbar. But one of the cooler things is we actually have all of these Windows applications here as well. So these things aren't specific to ePrime, these are actually Windows applications. And one of the cooler ones is the Windows Device Manager. If you just click on Tools and click on Device Manager, this lets you know about all of the devices currently connected to your computer. And this is most helpful if you're using either socket or parallel or serial port communication in your experiment. Let's say you need to know the LPT or the COM number. All you have to do is click on Tools and Device Manager. It'll bring you here, and all you have to do is find just that COM and LPT listing and figure out what it is from there. Now keep in mind, I don't have a parallel serial port on here, it's just a laptop, so it's not necessarily going to show up on here, but this is a very quick and very easy way to get to here without having to find it through your computer's control panel. We also have the same for the joystick control panel. If you have a joystick connected and you want to know what joystick ID it is, because if you go to our experiment object here and you add a joystick, there's this property called joystick index. Now if you want to know what your joystick index is whenever adding a joystick to your experiment, just go to joystick control panel and it'll let you know if there's one connected and then what its index is and if it can read it. Granted, I don't have anything connected there again, so I don't necessarily need that. And the other one is your sound control panel. So if you want to know, what you're connected to and how loud your audio is coming out and what your recording devices are and what your sound devices are, you can get there very quickly just by going to Tools and going to Sound Control Panel. So it's a really, really nice and really useful tip. And while we're under the Tools panel, the other thing I want to mention too is this Reset Utility Windows. Let's say I am going crazy and I just delete my structure view like that, and I actually go a little more crazy and just delete all of them. They're just X out of all of them. What I can do is go to Tools and go to Reset Utility Windows. So now all the windows here are going to go back to the default layout the next time eStudio is open. So even if I just reopen eStudio now, it's actually not going to save me closing all of those windows, because part of what ePrime likes to do is it likes to save the state of all of the windows that you have or that you've edited whenever you're working in eStudio. So let's say I have the structure window gigantic, ePrime assumes that's the way you like it and it keeps it that way. But if you look, none of my windows are closed and everything looks just the way that it did before. So that's another little helpful kind of tools menu setting. Now the next thing that's really cool that I want to bring up is going to be specific to buttons in ePrime, and this is something that I think doesn't get enough attention, honestly. And I'll show you here. If you go to the experiment object and add a button, and by default this is already here, and click on the properties button, and then click on this theme editor. This theme editor is really where a really powerful tool. As you can see here, it comes with 3 base themes, so a base button, a base choice, and a base slider. What not a lot of people know is you can actually click this Add Theme and make your own custom theme. It's just called Theme 1 right now, but you can make it whatever you want. So you can have it have it reference a parent theme. In this case, I'm just going to make it base button. But now I can change this and make this really customizable to however I want. So let's say I don't really like the normal gray theme of the base button, the base choice, and the base slider. In this case, we're just focused on base button. Let's say I don't like the typical gray theme and find that I'm always changing that. Now, instead of having to change that for every single button that you make, and instead of having to do that property find and replace, what I can do now is I can actually just pick an image that's going to be used as my default button image. So if I were to go to Program Files and then go to PST here, ePrime 3, and then I can go to Resources. Now let's say I want to make, this is something that not a lot of people know about either, we have this entire deck of cards that are already downloaded onto, into ePrime every single time that you download ePrime 3. And this deck of cards is actually supposed to be used in conjunction with button objects. So if you want to make solitaire, or if you ever have, let's say, a Monty Hall task or anything like that that you'd want to use a card in relation to, we have these cards already pre-programmed and already downloaded in the resources folder of ePrime. So these are already ready for you. So let's say I want, let's say, a blue card back to be my theme 1, and I want to rename this theme just to cards, or deck of cards. Now if I do that and I start editing these properties correctly, every time that I add this, so my image in this case is going to be that blue background, every time that I add a button object to my experiment, I have the option to choose from that deck of cards theme, and instead of just adding this basic button, I can go into my theme editor here, and instead of base button, I'll go to deck of cards, I'll click apply changes, and now if I stretch this out, it's going to look more like a deck of cards. So I have this background here. Now obviously there are things that I would need to change as well from the theme, so text of course wouldn't say button, I would want it to say nothing. And now instead of that button, but like I had before, I now have a card back. And if I do this and make a couple more, I can actually have just playing cards all over the place. And these will be really good for, you know, if I have this could be like my mask, for example. And if I click on the button, then it would flip over and I would see the front of the card. And that actually kind of brings me to the other time-saving tip that I like, is the feedback tab for these button objects. Now the feedback tab can be accessed, as you saw, either under the theme here, or it can be accessed in the entire the major theme or the theme editor here. And I'm just going to edit in the theme editor for now. But if you take a look at this radio button at the top, you can see that right now it says styles. This is just for the base button, just for however it is whenever it's just sitting there, and you can change it to normal, hover, down, fixated, checked, hover, and how they all look. But if I go into feedback, I can actually add a feedback object, and I can change what happens to this object whenever I click on it. So I can change the response type, so instead of a click, I can change what happens when I hover over the button, I can change what happens when I fixate on it, when I long press, when it's checked, or when it's just pressed down and not necessarily clicked. I can add a sound device, so I can click browse for sound, and if I go to that C drive again, and go to sounds, you can see that we actually added a few sounds automatically with any install of ePrime. So let's say I want to add a click sound on the press, and I wanted to activate it. So if I do this, now every time that I run into this button, because it's under that theme, whenever I click on it, ePrime is going to make a very audible click sound, and I don't have to do any script in order to load that. All I do is click on it, and because I have that, and you can see under this theme here for feedback, you can see that I have that click sound already activated. Now whenever this button loads and I click on it, it's just going to make a click noise. So that's something that I can add and something that I can do without having to do any sort of the complicated script that would have been involved when I did this in ePrime 2. So it's a really great time-saving technique, and it's something that not a lot of people really know that you can do. So it's really a good tip and a good thing to practice whenever you're using buttons. Alright, so the last group that we have are scripting tips and tricks. And a lot of these are not necessarily time-saving, but they are best practices. Especially if you find yourself writing a lot of script, or if you have a very script-intensive program, or even if you're getting that script too large to be compiled error, these tips are really going to help you out. The first one that we recommend is kind of shying away from any string literals. So if I were to do, let's say, dim the word a string, and then the word equals word. So let's say in this case this little, there we go. Let's say this string that I had made, this is what's called a string literal in ePrime, and this actually ends up taking up a lot of space whenever ePrime goes to compile this. And if you ever run into a script too large to be compiled error, these are one of the major causes of that. What we recommend is, instead of making defining a string literal, we recommend instead in the user script defining a constant. So you would just type the word constant, and then you would put the string that you want. ePrime, and the reason that we recommend this is because ePrime actually ends up dealing with constants in a much more efficient manner than it would a string literal, and takes up much less space and much less memory. That way you can kind of save a lot of time and a lot of effort by defining that constant, and then you can use that constant whenever you want in your experiment in the same way that you would have with that string literal. And it just will make your experiment run a little smoother. If you're running into timing delays, we recommend doing this. If you're running into that script too large to be compiled error is kind of the major driving force of this one, we recommend definitely always doing that constant. We call it just turning into a constant. The other one too is sticking with data types. So this goes kind of hand in hand with that. Where we see this a lot is if people are manipulating numbers. We'll see a lot of like dim number 1 as long, dim number 2 as integer, dim number 3 as double, and then we'll just do number 1 equals 1, 2 equals 2, and number 3 equals 3. So we're just doing something very simple like this. We're just setting these to the value of a number. We can see here that it's set to 3 different data types, a long, an integer, and a double. Technically, none of these are wrong. None of these are going to crash your e-prime experiment. None of these are going to do anything, unexpected if we're just setting these to basic numbers 1, 2, and 3. But since they're all kind of performing the exact same function, it doesn't really make sense to have these as different data types, because you can get into unexpected situations with each one of them. So let's say I'm manipulating number 1 in a certain way, and I'm manipulating number 2 in the exact same way. I might end up getting into an overflow error in this integer if I do a number greater than the integer limit. So it's always nice if you're using numbers to perform the same kind of functions, to always keep them with the exact same variable type. Now, or exact same data type. In this case, I want to make all of them longs because they're just holding 1, 2, and 3. And the reason that I'm doing a long instead of an integer, and this kind of brings up another nice tip and trick, is that the long can hold much more information or much more data, and the long limit is much higher than an integer limit. Now, back in the day, when, back in, let's say, in the advent of computers, and back when memory was kind of a scarcity in computers, it was really important to differentiate between an integer and a long, and it was important to only use an integer, or to mostly use an integer and only use a long when you really, really needed to, because longs were much bigger and therefore took up much computing power. But in this day and age, honestly, there isn't anything that you can do with a long that isn't going to be completed just as quickly as an integer. So in this case, if you have to choose between an integer and a long, we definitely recommend the long as opposed to the integer, because the integer may end up getting you in trouble if it overflows or anything like that. The long is much more flexible to work with and doesn't take up half as much computing power as it used to back in the day because of computers. Computers have advanced and they've just gotten better, so there's no need to do anything like integer and long at the same time if you're just going to be manipulating them in the same way. And the last one that I have to mention is kind of a more advanced scripting feature, but it's really, really useful if you're going to be manipulating the properties of an object and you want those properties to already be loaded into context. And this has to do with script task events. Now, I mentioned before, this is kind of a more advanced topic, and if you have any questions about this, please feel free to submit a support ticket. But if you go ahead and add a task event to an experiment, a lot of the times people will add a task event to the .onset time of the object, and the .onset time of the object is when the object first appears on the screen. So when it appears on the screen, do this thing. That is most helpful if you're going to be sending triggers or anything like that. But if you're going to be doing manipulation to this object and you want to wait to the very last minute for all of a different variable to be loaded into context for anything to kind of happen, instead of using the .onset time, we're going to use the .start time. Now, the .start time is defined in E' as whenever the object begins performing its critical actions. So in this case, whenever the slide object begins drawing on the screen. In E' terms, this is the very last second that you have to change anything about the screen, is this .start time. So if I wanted to do a script task event in this case, that would change the order of the buttons on the screen based on the participant's answer to slide 1, just as an example. What I would do is I would actually manipulate that using the start time instead of the .onset time, because if I have the .onset time, everything's already been drawn to the screen and I've already missed my opportunity to manipulate the screen. If I do the start time, that is the last possible second that I have to manipulate anything that I want, and it makes it much more efficient. That way I don't need an inline object before the stimulus object. I don't have to type everything out, and I don't have to worry about the associated delays that might be involved in that inline object and all the commands that I have written there. If I do a script task event on the .start time, it's going to execute as soon as the .start time happens on the object, and it'll allow me to execute that script much more efficiently and much faster anyway. So that's definitely what we would recommend if you're going to be doing any editing to any properties on the e-object itself. Alright, so that is all the tips and tricks I have for you today. If you have a favorite ePrime tip or ePrime trick or something that I didn't mention today that you think everyone else should know about, please feel free to leave a comment. I'm always happy to hear about your guys' favorite tips and tricks. Otherwise, feel free to like and subscribe to our channel. It lets us keep doing what we do. And as always, if you have any questions at all, feel free to go to support.pstnet.com. That's our product service and support site. Go ahead and send us in a support ticket. We'd be happy to answer any of your questions at all. Thank you very much, guys, and I hope you have a great day.